2 or 3 species, and almost all of them be out of one species.
On the other hand, catfish have particularly hard bones. I mean, this is a fact.
Yes, sure.
Catfish bones.
They're durable.
Yes, they're durable.
Vertebrates is what we generally have.
I don't know whether these are any easier to catch, but I mean, when the flood waters go down, all you need to do is simply just dam up a stream and walk around, and
There they are.
the mud in the water will exclude the oxygen, and the fish simply just come to the surface, and that's the regular way in which mudfish are collected today in Zambia.
Another point that's relevant, in the case of the Omo and Lake Rudolph, the only fish that was exploited until net fishing was introduced by the fisheries department was in fact Nile perch, which is the big counterpart of your catfish.
Right.
And it was just one thing, although it's by no means the only fish. It was a big fish and relatively easy to catch by spearing and normal sorts of techniques. Second point, we talked about hippos, and I was thinking of crocodiles. Crocodiles as a barrier to moving around. In the Omo, this is a very serious barrier, as I know from my personal experience. Unless you have a good dugout canoe and are prepared to fend off the crocodiles in due course, you don't cross the river if you don't need to. And if you have a strongly fragmented maze of channels, this might be one of the best effective boundaries to people moving around indiscriminately.
On the other hand, crocodile populations do behave differently in different places, depending upon whether they're used to eating human meat and animals generally or not. There are places, again, where you can bathe in crocodiles. There's that magnificent story of Dan Livingstone's falling off the boat on one side of the crocodile and swimming for about a mile or so. The crocodiles didn't touch him at all.
Well, but they continued to fight with the boat. I mean, this was what saved them. The crocodiles continued to attack the boat.
Well, fair enough. Well, but there are other places.
No, but
Lake Bangweolo, or most of those lakes up there, the crocodiles won't touch you, but it's as much as your life is worth to go into the Kafue or the Upper Zambezi.
Sure, well, this is the same also with Rudolph. It's said, parts of Rudolph, there are different populations apparently. But the thing we talk about this thing as a tube, but we forget the tube has sides on it.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And not only sides,
we didn't get into
you
that at
have
all.
braiding
That's right.
of
The complications.
of complications of
Yeah.
channel islands and
Right.
of multiple channel bars and things of this sort, and some of them are just floodplain active during one part of the year, and others are
One
there
thing we
the-
haven't
And not just that, I think
Carl,
we
is
forgot
the,
that in the Nile Valley itself, sometimes it's
fish
just,
traps, of which we have abundant evidence at Abka, were described by Myers, and I've seen them myself. Double rows of stones with one row open, like the mouse trap type of thing.
Once you go in, you can't get out.
Yeah,
Or
this
you're too stupid to find them
Yeah.
when you came in.
but
And these go back to 6,000 BC at least, on carbon dates.
yeah, I would think that this is the kind of thing that the traps closed of clods of earth and this kind of thing, that sort, went probably back into the Middle Pleistocene. I mean, they're extremely simple things to do.
Should we break for lunch?
Very nice stuff.
This is tape number 4, side 2.
very thin and angular. That's all right, it's not working on it. We would not let it do. It's finished. It's gone.
Afternoon session.
Worked with Jean
Session
for 4 years.
4.
He worked at Red Chef. Seems to be the one that everybody feels everything has to go into. I hope we can begin to cover some of the things in the time involved. This is supposed to be a discussion of some theoretical concepts. I would like to try to impose a certain structure on the discussion, merely so we don't end up discussing a whole series of concepts at the same time. And for this reason, I'd like to suggest we start with what we at SMU, or at least what I consider to be the minimal significant unit in building larger archaeological units, and that is what we refer to as an assemblage. And what I believe other people have referred to as an adequate aggregate, not any aggregate. One of the basic problems, I suppose, is that before we can build larger units, we have to be able to compare the smaller units. And we have to be able to conceptualize them. And I think this is perhaps where everybody has been, including people we've worked with here, have been somewhat weak on. Often we don't compare the same things because we're not making the same observations. I think it might be worthwhile discussing what are the kinds of observations that seem to be useful? What are the limits of difference and similarities that we might consider in grouping assemblages together to form larger units? And under what circumstances do archaeological material fall into a range of what we would consider to be useful in formulations? Now, I think the first thing, in reference to an assemblage or adequate aggregate, is what is the kind and degree of association we really have to have before we can think of a collection of artifacts as being useful for building any kind of larger units? I know pretty much what we think, and or at least what I think, and it's been passed out in a small statement about that. But I never got a very clear picture of this from publications that came out of Wachenstein. I wondered whether someone could elucidate. I don't think
Tony,
we're...
would you first summarize your...
Well, you know, everybody's got it. I would hate it'd be silly to read it. No, I know, but I think it will come in discussion. What are the limits, for instance, Glenn, that you would impose on a collection before you would consider it useful?
Well, that's a very tall order question. The first point that I would make is that this, you were quite right in saying this, there were lots of sticky wickets at Wachenstein, and we did stay off this one, and there isn't a defined unit at this level if we look carefully at the proceedings. I don't think that this term adequate, I think we might dispose of this term adequate aggregate right away. It's horribly ugly and quite unnecessary. The notion was that we might use some such word as aggregate to deal with simply a heap of specimens before you made any judgment about them. That there is no degree of interpretation, abstraction, or anything else involved in the use of the word of the term aggregate or any other comparable.
How do you recognize aggregate then?
Well, when you've
Through
got
recognition?
when you've got a set of samples, a set of specimens,
Right.
however you achieve them in the field that you're going to consider together, and these are the physical objects that constitute the aggregate. You may then judge whether you regard this as an assemblage or whether you're going to group several aggregates together to constitute your assemblage, which would be, in a sense, your first judged decision.
You would make a
Didn't you call it an
distinction.
artifactum or something like that?
It's okay by me, I'm not going to defend individual words.
You would make a distinction then between your use of the term aggregate and the term assemblage.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'd be in favor of dropping the word aggregate since it has an ethnographic context, a fairly well-defined one. And what we seem to be doing is to creating the archaeological equivalent of an ethnographic aggregate.
I'm in favour of dropping aggregate because it takes too long to say and to write in comparison with sample. I'm serious.
Yeah, well, sample, except that sample often does involve a judgment.
Sample may also imply a statistical concept.
That's why we avoided it.
Anyway, perhaps we shouldn't spend a lot of time discussing individual words now and on the table. If there were agreement that
Well, we
there
better have
is a
some words, or
concept.
I don't know what you're saying, and you don't know what he's saying, and vice versa. If we don't even, if we must at least pick words and define them, whether we like the definitions or not, just so we can talk to each other.
Is it appropriate to ask what we're constructing the tool for?
Yeah.
To what end? Do we want to have a bunch, an assemblage, a sample, an aggregate, or what?
as a basic talking unit for analysis and hopefully for interpretation.
Well, it also
Is it
goes
meaningful?
more than that. It's
Go.
for comparison within the area in which you're working and outside of the area in which you're working.
This is a talking
This
unit.
is the base, right? This is the base.
The
of
language,
That's all I'm
right.
saying.
But you have to have a separate word, I think, for the set of objects that you're talking about. And any construct that you put on, you have to be able to say, I have an X, an aggregate, which I regard as an adequate sample to constitute it for purpose of discussion and comparison and assemblage. This is at least would be my notion, that it's useful to have something which is concrete, something which is in a sense outside the system of abstractions and is the material itself, without regard to what you think it is, whether you think it was made by a few people in a short time or whether it's all.
You're really talking about the given unit, regardless of however you got it, okay, or how it was given. A given unit, whether you excavated everything, whether
Yeah.
you stumbled on something, whether you bought it, you know.
Exactly so.
Whatever it is, that's it. That's the given unit,
It's what's
okay?
on the
That's the
table.
minimum, because by definition it is minimum. That's all you have. And from that, you can go in all directions.
By this-
But we have to know what we're saying when we say that.
You're meaning a lot of different things if you're talking about things you buy in the drugstore. or things you pick
That's
up on the
right,
street.
that's
So-
right. But everybody keeps thinking that these things are in fact all the same, that aggregates have a kind of commonness about them, and they do not.
No.
That's part of the reason we chose that word, is because it doesn't have a commonness about it. It only has a kind of minimalness about it.
I guess it implies more than one object, that's probably there.
No, implicit in everything we've said so far is that we all agree that it is a clutch of artifacts found in close
Clutch, that's really nice.
association.
No.
All right?
What was
The
that?
association may be the first question you ask about the aggregate. Were they found in close? Somebody may bring you in a box of artifacts
Yeah.
they collected during their life.
I see.
This
That's
is still
also
an aggregate.
Oh, well,
But the
that's
first
news to
decision you
me.
make is to throw
It's
them
just
away.
the stuff itself. That's all. As long as everybody knows, but somebody pick a word. You got
Why
a
don't you
chairman.
call it a collection? Collection doesn't imply that it sort of adheres together like an aggregate does.
Why don't we call it occurrence?
Well,
Archaeological
No,
occurrence.
that's already preempted and it does mean something different.
I think collection is a very good idea in the sense that aggregate implies, especially ethnographically,
It
something
seems
that
to
has
me what you're
cohesion.
talking about is some kind of a collection.
Well, yeah, my
Each of
question
these-
is here, are you using the word aggregate to cover in an archaeological excavation everything that comes out of it?
Well, these are, you've made, this depends on how you dig the site. If you keep everything from a metre square separately, then in a sense, each of those metre squares will, if you put the collection on the table, that would be an aggregate. You may decide that this whole series of metre squares can be, all these aggregates can be put together.
That's not the way we used it at Barton's time. Whether it's a meter square or or 1 square millimeter or a mile, it's the occurrence that we were talking about. that the
Well,
aggregate
Still, it's the
represents.
unit of analysis,
Yeah,
though, and
that's
it's the
right.
sample. And if
It's-
you're analyzing material by levels, then the aggregate was the sample from that level that you're trying to infer something towards this wider unit, which perhaps was the assemblage.
Yeah, the crucial thing is it's the specimens themselves,
Yeah, right.
without regard
But
to
it's the
their
unit of
content.
analysis, the ones that you are looking at for purposes of trying
Yeah.
to
In any
derive some
given
inferences.
discovery.
But you've already
Yeah.
made an assumption there.
Well, not necessarily. You might have an aggregate here, as Glenn says, someone comes and dumps a bunch of stuff on the table. It might have come from one end of the Nile Valley to the other. Well, your analysis might be, as Glenn suggested, that this is worthless and throw it out.
So it can't be used without a modifier. I think, though, isn't it implied that, I understood from the Barkenstein conference, it was implied that an aggregate was something that, a unit that came, a usable unit that came from an archaeological occurrence. And that throws out all the collections from
Yes, exactly. That's
boxes
just
and
how
so
I
on. This is,
understood
I
it.
think, valid.
Well, we didn't define aggregate, so this
Yeah,
really is
but the
beyond
occurrence
discussion.
was not defined in terms of, specifically in terms of its space-time aspect.
No, it was
I mean, we said there could be many
Yeah.
kinds, without saying how many.
Yeah, it was simply a term to describe the lithic unit, or if there were bone artifacts there, presumably bone tools as well as a unit. We preferred that to assemblage, because I think assemblage has formal significance.
Well, as I understand it, at least in the American usage, assemblage implies a judgment that it is an adequate aggregate,
Yes.
which is a first step in study. And this is what we were trying to break down.
Now,
Find a word which you could use
It's the
before you made the
judgment, I
judgment.
think, here that's important.
Sure.
Is the point of this to establish a formal language of increasing specificity? I don't quite understand why it's necessary to have a term which includes a collection that somebody brings in from God knows where, and a collection of material that comes from a stratigraphic excavation, and another one that comes from a surface survey. One could conceivably construct such a thing. You could make a nonsense syllable to describe it, for that matter. It might be better to do it that way.
Some years ago, the New World archaeologists used to use the expression congeries. You remember how they were, what sense they were using it? I can't remember.
No, I don't remember the term. There was a certain historic, I'm historic from the sense of going back to this Berg-Wartenstein reason for this, namely, especially with the French there was quite a different concept about this. For the French, quite definitely, they had the concept that the assemblage, that some of us prefer to think of as the unit that we inferred from our data, was in fact the data they had there on the table, and we felt a rather strong necessity for being able to communicate to distinguish between the concept we were trying to arrive at and the actual material we were working with.
That's right. And it had to be cognitive. We had to have cognates, so we picked these things accordingly also.
But I think we essentially come down to the fact that if we have a collection, SAG prefer that term,
Yep.
we have to make some sort of judgment on it. And if it is useful, and useful in the sense that it can be used for comparisons, for making larger archaeological units which have assumed cultural correlates, then the way we make these judgments becomes important. Because hopefully, given the same collection, given the same knowledge about where it came from, how it was acquired, all archaeologists working in the same area would make the same judgment as to whether it was useful or not. That it
Yeah, well,
wouldn't
you
be
can-
totally subjective.
You can do this if you're being very specific. If you want to compare Levallois technique, you can talk about it, but it may be much more difficult if you include everything that may conceivably be found in a collection within which a few pieces have Levallois technique.
No, I don't mean it at that level. I mean at the level that if we come across, let us say, a surface site, a surface concentration of artifacts, as an archaeologist, I have to make the judgment based on certain criteria of whether one just says, well, this is a site which has elements from a number of different cultures, it's been sorted, it's been moved, it's not useful to me in any way, or whether I look at it and say, yes, it is in fact useful. And then I go on using it some other way. And I think the general principles of how we make these judgments, and whether we all make them the same way, is fairly important. I think there are people who would say only living floors are valid. We can only use living floors to say anything about construction of the concept of an industry.
And then you run into the case of Clark can recognize a Bentley from its radiator.
Yes. Yeah. So I think this is one of the big problems, and I'm not sure everybody is really communicating on how we do it. What are the criteria that, for instance, Glenn would use for deciding whether a collection is an assemblage?
Well, what is the purpose? I think Frank is right, you know.
Okay.
And so why not take 3 or 5 or whatever it is, different cases, and then say what you want to do with these cases? Then one could see.
All right, let us
Towards what
assume.
end
If your
we should
idea
do
is
this.
that you make comparisons on the basis of technology, then you will look at certain striking platforms and ratios of length to width and things like this. If you're interested in adaptation, you may look at the types. There are a lot of different things you can look at. That if you start out with the idea that something is important, then you can look at it. But to say that everything is important makes the thing completely hopeless
No,
task, it
it's
seems to
not
me.
the specific attributes of any of the objects that I mean.
All right, well, now you've made a judgment and said that that is not important, so then we can, we can
I'm
take
not-
that as a
no,
step and
no,
go somewhere else.
No, I'm not saying that they're not important. They're not, this isn't what I mean at this level. We are constructing, we constructed in our work in Nubia. We grouped certain assemblages together to form what we considered to be industries. That these we considered to be generally homogeneous, and they had specific or they had general cultural correlates. That we were interested in the culture, not particularly the artifacts.
I
It
thought
may
you
not have
assumed
come
that they were
across.
more similar to each other than they were to something else.
Yes, this is, and
So
on
what are
that
the
basis.
Well, yeah, but more than that is another order, complete different order, and in fact, it's not even in the same sort of trend of the analogy. You do one thing, then you do another thing, then you do another, and then you stop doing that, and then you go to a completely different sort of thing that has to do with cultural inference or trying to understand geomorphology or something. It is a completely different kind of operation, I would argue, philosophically.
It's a different operation, but
That's, I think, what Frank
ultimately,
is
we're
trying to say.
not comparing two groups of objects just for the sake of comparing two groups of objects.
You might.
You might, but I don't think
Yeah,
we really
look,
are.
You can compare by count if you want to.
Yeah, but look, surely, perhaps if there is confusion about this, at least my understanding is that what we're talking about is the classification of paleoculture through artifacts. And this, it seems to me, is what we're discussing. And there are two ways you can do it. The French prefer to start with the biggest units, and chop your way down until you get to the lowest ones, to take it that you have an intuitive recognition of the big units, and then that you carve your way down. We've chosen to start with discussing the other way, where you start with small units and fit them together, see how you fit them together. At least we have chosen by starting to discuss aggregate and assemblage. But it seems to me at least the goal of what we're talking about is how you classify artifacts in order to have a supposed relationship to a classification of culture. And your point about economy, of course, is well taken. You might well all want a completely different system if you were trying to classify prehistoric economies.
Well, now you say, okay.
But we aren't talking about that in my
If you want a
understanding directly.
classification so that it enables you to get at some kind of cultural units, you're starting with a classification and working to cultural units. I think you might argue that if you want cultural units, you may not want a classification. There may be something else that's important.
Well, surely a cultural unit is a classificatory unit. I mean, at least that would be my understanding. That we're just talking semantics back and forth. That the moment you say I have a cultural unit inferred from a series of objects, you're generalizing them into a category, which is a classification.
You might start by saying, what is a cultural unit?
May I say something? I think it'd be, I think a little bit of confusion pertaining to background again here. This particular session at Berg-Wartenstein had been requested by a previous session at the same series of meetings to construct this cultural stratigraphic scheme, yes, so that the kind of units had already been set for us. It might be that this meeting here doesn't feel that that's the best one, but at least that explains what we were doing there. So we had a definite hierarchical kind of scheme that we were aiming for and trying to choose a method of achieving these units at the different levels.
I think that's why we should have different, a distinction between socio-cultural units and archaeological units per se, based on based on artifacts.
Well, that's what I was saying to
one is
John a
based,
while ago.
one is based on the observable data, and the other one is inferential, and you use for it whatever data you get from ecology, economy.
Anything you pick.
And these must be two separate, conceptually different categories of classification.
I don't think the sociocultural evidence need necessarily be conceptual only. I mean, evidence from scatter patterns, distribution patterns, settlement features, and so on. This is the kind of evidence that is going to give you that, which is direct, factual, and there.
No, it's not. It's
Well,
the stuff is no, it's not. The stuff is actual, but the
Interpretation.
things that you draw from it are inferential.
Yes, sir.
I don't see how they could be otherwise.
But
Yeah, fair enough.
I think
Yes,
it
yes,
would be.
I mean, you know, you have to decide: is it a post hole?
Yeah.
Is it a rodent burrow? Is it so and so? That is inference, right? Based on
Yeah, it
knowledge
is. Yes, I agree.
and
Yeah.
testable hypothesis and
Yeah.
so on.
Nevertheless, this is at a different level from the pure unit of lithic material that one's trying to produce a taxonomy for.
Someone
It's outside the range of that. No,
Someone quotes somewhere, I can't remember the reference, the idea of increasing levels of abstraction, which is another way of saying what you've just said. The one basic fact in our nasty little lives is rocks, artifacts, they're real, and from there we take off into increasing levels of abstraction, moving outwards via our aggregate sample, what have you, out into the industry and presumably out into the complex. And presumably one of the levels of high levels of abstraction is going to be the interpretation of a scatter pattern. And I think that it probably doesn't fit in completely and neatly with this basic increase that we have organized so far, ending up with the complex.
No,
it does seem to be something different.
But as well, the
process seems
interpretation of the actual artifacts themselves is an interpretation of
That's
abstraction.
right. That's
See,
exactly
this is-
right, yeah.
You're back where we started.
Yeah.
Yeah, is there anyone sitting at this table who really believes when he calls something a scraper or a knife that it really is a scraper and a knife?
Exactly. I mean,
these are
The
labels.
only thing is not something
These are
else.
labels
That's mostly
we
what
use.
you're saying.
Yeah.
It's
It's
not
a
A or
label.
B, but it's C, probably.
But Clark, coming back to this point about the distinction between simply the physical, classifying the physical objects and classifying socio-cultural phenomena, I mean, I can recognize this in its purest form. On the other hand, if we don't take our socio-cultural objectives into mind while we discuss mechanical processes of comparing the thing, we're going to make an awful nonsense. And in fact, what we'll really be doing is hiding from ourselves the basis for our preference for certain methods over another. That is, very often, the reason why we would choose certain ways of comparing and grouping is because we think they're likely to give to have a closer relationship to the socio-cultural thing. That is, so if you like, at some point, we would want to link two morphologically quite distinct facies if we had reason to believe that they were products of the same person, same people. And if we were purely talking about classifying artifacts, we would not want to make that distinction. And
I think that's so, but this is what Frank was saying before. I feel sure that there's many different things that you can conceivably do.
Sure.
Probably many that you can't conceive of conceivably doing, okay? That's a very different sort of thing. But the question is, what do you do minimally? And that is extremely important because some people in Poland do one thing, and some people in Dallas do another, maybe, and some people somewhere else do something else. And if we could then agree on that, then we'd at least have that out of the way so that when something was called a so-and-so, everybody, lights went on, and we knew that that's what it was. We have a mental image, we know the ranges, the parameters that are there, we know where it cuts off and where it begins, and then we're on to another sort of level of discussion and a mutual understanding. But if we don't have that, then we're flummoxed from the very beginning. For example, how are you going to treat, quote, natural stone in an archaeological occurrence that has been untouched in any way other than to be placed there?
Doesn't this all come
I mean,
down?
there's lots of these loose ends, you see, that have to be dealt with.
Doesn't this all come down to, however, given all this discussion, sir, what we want to do? I mean, some people here, I'm sure, want to reconstruct. Some people in archaeology want to reconstruct cultural history. Some people want to look at the nature of culture and explain cultural variability. So other people want to just talk in historical terms. I mean, if you have
like to talk about Belle Pièce and how it was made and so on. That's all they care about.
Right. All right.
That's
So
true.
once you have a basic goal, you, as we all well know, you dig sites differently by the nature of your questions, etc. So first of all, I think this discussion is, I hate to say it, is rather inane on one level because I don't think all of us agree on what you want to do.
No, but look, biology has exactly the same problem. When you've got species and genera and families, lots of people do quite different things in their study of these things and how they work. But they have the maturity to have achieved a framework of discussion of the taxonomy of living things. It's not that there aren't any difficulties, but there is an international framework. Not because they're all studying the same things about species and subspecies and genera, but because it has been found that it is possible for people to do quite different things to share a common framework of simply of labels. And this is really, as I understand it, what we're discussing, whether or not prehistoric archaeology has a need for a common set of defined concepts, which, whether you're going to study economy, cultural history, or Bell PS, will be of use in communicating with your fellow men. And I think a point that's worth considering in this connection is the fact that until very recently, in the old world anyway, prehistory was a minute subject. There were probably less than 50 specialists, full-time professionals. Suddenly, since the war, the whole thing's burgeoned and there are now thousands of them. And with this, as well as with the sort of increasing elaborate demands of interpreting and discussing all sorts of aspects of our data, there just has grown up an enormous communication problem, which nomenclature, and organized nomenclature, may help. And it does seem to me that whether we're primarily interested in culture history or not, there are culture historic units. And
Sure,
in
but
a
it seems
sense,
to me,
it's the
but
classification
when
of
you
these that we're
classify
trying to
certain
talk
I
about.
think they're to be sought, not to be defined, the latter.
Sure.
And I think that what you say also about biological concepts is also only partly true. We went through this at Bartenstein. Everybody who knows anatomy perhaps can say that this is a foramen ovale or something like that, or a mastoid process. But everybody says, sure, this is something in the hierarchy of subspecies, species, genus, but nobody agrees as to where you draw the lines. Not a
Oh, I'm
soul.
not talking about individual classifications.
And those are highly confident people
They're
who
agreed on
disagree.
on the hierarchy. This is
They've
what
just
we're discussing.
arbitrarily chosen a hierarchy.
Yeah, but we haven't even done that. This is what I was saying.
They also, because they base their classification on morphology only, and we introduce here another factors, which are the, as you
No,
said,
they'll throw in
social,
genetics,
cultural
behavior, all sorts of things.
no, but you don't use that for
very complex.
taxonomy.
But
Yes, they
genetics
do.
can
taxonomy.
get it.
It's not obvious that stone tools interbreed, and that the rules of biology are necessarily applicable to the things we're talking about.
I'm not suggesting. for
And
a
every
moment
time that we
it's-
classify something, we're automatically limiting possibilities. Don't you, when you make a unit?
We've got to
Depends
have
on how you
some kind
classify.
of-
Exactly, sure.
You classify
And so
on the
how you
basis of what you
classify-
know,
Yeah, how you
or what
classify
is already
based on
known
that,
and what you then
exactly.
add to the knowable,
Exactly,
assuming
and
it
on what you
extends the
wanna know.
definition.
Yeah, and on what you want to know.
But that's just by giving a name to something that is recognizable, and presumably the recognition can be repeated by other people, assuming they're informed.
Yeah.
That's a very simple thing, and I think that if you wanted to talk about that level, which is a very good level to talk at, by the way, because there are very important differences in concepts as to how you define those things, which some people like to call types, and how what are attributes, you know. And but everybody here would somehow or other differ from everybody else about some of those very important things.
Just look at the discussion.
We built certain things, and they had two units. One of them we call the assemblage, and the other one we call the industry. Let's just cut it through to this and see how.
That's
we-
fine. Now tell us
Now,
how you
now,
recognize
the
those.
assemblage, what we looked at for our basic building block was the locality, which we'd hoped by inference would be the surviving material left by a single residential group over a limited period of time. Now, that's what we were trying to get at. Now, that was the inference. So we sought those situations where we felt we would get that kind of information. Now, those collections that we obtained from those localities, those circumscribed localities, were the things that we called assemblages. And they were deliberately intended to be, therefore, living floors. Not rolled, derived, moved, anything but living floors, or material that was just right off the slope, but could be directly related to that living floor. Now, then we took those assemblages, in which there were 100 of them, and said some of these look more like each other than they look like anything else. And those assemblages varied among themselves in perhaps reflecting activity variation, perhaps reflecting time, perhaps simply reflecting geography, space. But they were more like what we had than anything else. And those we put together and said, and that meant a three-dimensional concept. And those things we called industries. And in order to have some way of recognizing them, instead of giving them numbers, which makes it very difficult, or letters, we gave them names.
what
But you
everybody at
also-
the table has done at some time or other.
But you also, did you not, let me ask you, at the time, you did not group these just by looking at the artifacts. You used stratigraphy also, did you not?
No,
No,
Just looking at the stone tools on the table.
that's
Okay.
right.
that's right.
That's
All
right.
right.
We took the
No,
stone-
more than tools.
well,
Stone
the
artifacts,
artifacts,
the entire whatever you wanna call it,
The assemblies,
right?
the assemblies. And one of the things that we thought would be, we feel like this is a useful two-step concept. And one of the things that we have tried to move beyond that little, the sort of stumbling steps that we did in Nubia, we have tried to refine what kind of information we can get out of these assemblages in order to refine the parameters of what we mean by industries more precisely. And
I
this
think
is part
also-
what this,
Also, one of the reasons we've been trying to do this is so that the comparisons between assemblages would become more standardized and more complete.
And more explicit.
And much more explicit.
That's the
Instead
point.
of saying,
That's
well,
the
they
point.
look the same.
Right.
We
Instead
have
of
to say,
saying,
how
they're
do they look
obviously
the
different
same?
cats,
In
we want to
what
be able
way?
to say how they're different, precisely, you see, and agree, perhaps among, at least we can have some idea of what we're each talking about, of what degree of difference is necessary in order for it to be. We could agree upon what is required for an assemblage. I should think that could be a working arrangement. And then discuss, but perhaps never agree upon, what is required to be a difference between industries.
The degree of difference.
Degree of
or
difference.
degree
Yeah.
of
The degree of
similarity
likeness
is-
to
Because in part, if
There's a lot of
we
trouble.
looked at a history of a valley in which one population was there, and we, by accident of our survival, the survival of the materials we're working with, we're gonna get out of that continuum some plugs here and there. And those plugs may look so unlike each other that there's no way from the surviving information now available that we'll be able to ever to agree that there's a link. Now, this is the problem between Cormusen and Mousterian. See, that really is. There's such a gap in that plug. We can't agree whether we cannot demonstrate to ourselves that this gap is in actuality a direct continuum locally, or if this is some other phenomena is represented in this similarity that we see. And so rather than confuse, blur this distinction that we think is important, we give them different handles. And those are nothing but handles. But someone else might look at this same group of materials and say, well, these are close enough together that we should give them all the same name. There were long debates among us whether Jamayan is really different from Gaden. I mean, there's no, I don't know that there's a house rule on how to make that decision.
Could
In
I,
fact, that were made individually.
Right.
could I make a suggestion now? The very fine quantitative data which you've made available can now be used to measure literally quantities of difference, and this should be the next step, to take precisely, in fact calculate a percentage of difference between different, well, you could simply take type lists as are up on the board, ignore the percentages, that do both industries, in your sense, share all the types, first of all.
Some do and some don't.
Okay, well, this could be sorted out.
You
Well,
can't-
there are
there-
many
there-
variables, and they're going to be
You can't
various.
measure
They're
similarity among
immeasurable.
dissimilar things, that's for sure.
One of the things that we wanted to suggest and discuss today was that we're not satisfied with the metric data that we were able to provide before, because in working with the, as our own familiarity with this material has become slightly more sophisticated, we see that there are many things that we should have observed in the Nubian materials that might help us in refining this, measure this distance or measure this difference between them. And one of the things we were wanting to bring out is, and learn from you, are these are some of the new things we're going to try to observe. What sort of things are we missing now? What are we still failing to see because of our blindness and lack of comprehension about what is found in our adjacent areas? And then another point, I think it would be a great help if some of these same things can be done and observed elsewhere in Africa. It would help us make comparisons with your materials. All the old world, yes.
Well, that's what's being done all the time, isn't it, some way or other, without people formally sitting down, usually informally, sitting down and deciding to do it. But they also have to make damn sure that they're doing things in comparable ways, or then you have incomparable results.
If you had not worked in Francois Bourd's laboratory on his typology with him, I mean, you took a collection and studied, and you, I understand it was over 90% correlation.
Yeah.
If you had not worked with him, or if I had not worked with Tixier, et cetera, I'll wager that it would have been about, or really be very familiar with, I'll wager you just don't come up with you miss things. That little cutoff line, you know, which kind of goes over, you miss it. He could find it. You could find it because you
As long
work.
as he's internally consistent, then it doesn't matter as long as you're comparing his things. But then if you compare somebody else's, you're automatically in trouble.
Well, there is a point here that I think one has to be very careful. I'm sure we're all agreed on the need for as wide a uniformity in observational methods and the kind of attributes that are recorded and the divisions of them. However, I think that we would be deluding ourselves if we thought that we could draw up a uniform list that would solve all our problems. And lots of problems depend on an assessment where you look at this thing assemblage, or if you've got it to the industry level, industry A, and look at the relevant things to compare it with, form an impression of what some of the differences may be, and then devise specific measures which will clarify the reality and extent of these differences. So a lot of it simply has to be designed semi-experimentally for each particular comparative situation.
And you don't think that it's possible to have a minimum set of
I'm sure it's possible to have a minimum set,
of observations that would fit any type of archaeological assembly?
Yeah, I'm sure that there could be a minimum.
Certain kinds as opposed to others. Let me give you an example of what I think is, I hate to use this example, but I'm forced to do it, of what not to do. There have been some relatively widely used, more or less repeatable systematics that have been developed to describe certain kinds of assemblages, okay? Somebody digs a site, in this case in North Africa. He writes a big monograph about it, and he doesn't give you any way of translating his what's its and whose its and so on into any of the other choices that he could have made where people have done things. In this case, we're talking about McBurney and Halfdan. You cannot move back and forth to put these things into other people's categories. Now, he could say, I don't like them. That's all right. You don't, that's okay. But you ought to at least say that what I call this is the same as X is this, Y is that. That's all you have to do. And I think that's what you're saying, that this is a kind of minimal scientific responsibility that we have.
Okay, and this would, I think, would apply not only to the tool typology, but there are observations.
Well, you do. Everybody else does it, geologists, paleontologists, everybody.
Exactly.
What makes us so exceptional that we refuse to look at somebody else's naming of something? You don't have to like the name and bring your own name in, but you must at least be sufficiently aware, and in this case I think it's responsibility, frankly, of putting your things into the broader context of scientific endeavor in some way.
Right.
That's really what you have to do.
Doesn't it really, I hate to bring up the biological analogy again, but in taxonomic studies of biological populations, there is a little rule that says that the first fully described name for a species is the one that must be used at all times.
Unless it can be changed by the international rules,
Right.
by the
Now-
commission. Otherwise, it sticks.
I
But
realize
we don't
this
have any
is-
commission like that.
Yeah, well, this would be very hard to do, but at the same time, perhaps is, well, the book by Brézillon is an example of an attempt to follow this through.
Well, the other difference, of course, Frank was attacking me for the biological analogy. The other difference is, and they're very fortunate in this, there is a point at which biological classification, by and large, is not arbitrary, and that's the species. Something like 90-95% of the organisms in this world do fall into species, which are real things. There's nothing arbitrary about it. We don't, unfortunately, in archaeology, have anything which is at that thing. The whole business is
And
fluid.
assemblage comes very close to it if we limit its definition as we're.
No, well, assemblies I wouldn't regard it remotely analogous to a species.
It's a real thing.
Oh, it's a real thing, but it's not a classificatory thing.
But
It's an interpretative
I think
thing.
the only real thing in the world is
it's-
not the
it's not-
species,
it's
but
not
it's
classic- you're not-
populations. Populations are the only real thing in nature. Even Simpson will say, and Meyer and other people, that as regard to species, we have agreed says he, that means me and my friends, have agreed as to what the species is going to be, how it's going to be defined, you know, limited populations, interbreeding, and all this business. But a lot of other people don't agree with that. And a lot of people who deal with paleontological material do not agree among themselves. People who are working on this, on the same, quote, series of populations of, let's say, murid rodents in a restricted area will not agree on the boundaries of how they are going, the parameters to set out the boundaries of species. But populations they can recognize, because populations have distributions, they have edges around them, and you can go and measure them, sample them, do all kinds of things with them. We can also do that with artifact occurrences, or whatever you want to call these things, and we can measure as to how much they have changed, if we know something about geology, stratigraphy, etc. So there, at that level, there's some sort of analogy, I suppose.
Yes, I would accept an analogy between population and assemblage. I don't think it's very useful to argue about analogies, but that would be a more reasonable conjunction.
But surely the thing that traditional prehistorians have thought of as analogous to the species is, and have even used the same modes of getting at it, is the type, having a type specimen as the old biologist.
Traditionally,
sure. Yeah, sure.
That's right. That's why there were so many species.
But surely,
no two things are alike, right?
But surely we are in danger that classifying individual artifacts into types and so on is quite different from classifying assemblages. It's a tool that you may use in classifying assemblies. I don't think we should run these.
That's the point I was wanting to get at here. These are two entirely different things.
But I would hope that we would never, that we would never think or plan, or I would support the position that you said, that we should never have a fossilized type list. No. Because we haven't, even working as close together as we are here in this building, 5 or 6 of us that are classifying these things, we don't agree among ourselves on the exact parameters of some of these things that are called types.
That is exactly what the French have.
And I think it's very dangerous.
Type list.
Yeah, but that's still only partly true, Desmond. I mean, it sounds when you say type list that you really, a list type is not really a type list. I know that it sounds like that, but in fact, that's semantics again. In fact, and those here, and there are a number who have had anything directly to do with this kind of classificatory work, putting labels on things, will in fact tell you that there are different parameters in different sorts of occurrences. And that if, let's say, type X, whatever it was, type 12 of something, was for some reason or other recognized as this sort of thing from this sort of site, that didn't mean that that's all that it could ever be. Later it had to be expanded, and in fact has been expanded, even though the old thing is, maybe originally the publication makes you think that it can only look like that, but subsequently from other work, and as work goes on, people then change the concept, but they don't change the fossilized publication. That is the problem. Brezillon talks about this, for example. And certainly, if you've called things, let's say, and used in some cases, cumulative graphs, I would be willing to bet that you have come very close to, let's say, a particular type in the final Paleolithic, or, well, Tixier's things maybe. But you don't always hit exactly the middle of that, the mean or the median of that type. You're somewhere within the range, and of course the nature of the concept of the type is being changed automatically the more you learn about other kinds of occurrences.
Well, the problem here really is that, to the best of my knowledge, no one, with possible exception of Tony, has ever sat down and thought about what the actual range of variation is for a type as such.
You're talking about the world at large.
Well, I've never seen it. What I mean is that I have never seen this in print anywhere in terms of taking a type, a specific type as we know it, and going over everything and saying, okay, now the range of variation for this type is A to B. for this parameter?
No, nobody's done that. It's much more topsy-like. It's impossible to do it, of course. That's why nobody's done it.
No,
It's topsy-like, and it grows by a process of accretion some way or other as you've learned. And when you find later on that it becomes so vague and non-parametric, then you throw it out, or you do something new with it, perhaps. You have to keep testing it. It's not something that is fixed and immutable and so on. If Board were here, or Tixie, I'm sure that they would agree with that concept. I mean, you use those, for example, as examples, some of the most extreme examples.
In some senses, of course, the masters have felt freer than their, I might say, their disciples in this regard. Ein Board can go around the world, and when he comes to a situation where he's outside his type list, he says so.
Yeah, sure.
His students feel a little less happy about sort of declaring themselves free and on their own.
I think maybe we've skirted around a very important problem here, that the type is not a basic building block. Of course, there's an even more basic one, which is simply the attribute, and a type is a peculiar repeated attribute cluster, and there hopefully will emerge techniques for making these attributes cluster, so that we will then be relieved of the responsibility of having to say this is, or has one of those names on the board, for instance, although we do know within very loose terms, all of us didn't need to be coaxed into a picture of what those names meant yesterday, with the possible exception of Uchtota, I think. Now, this has been done. Hilary Deacon, re-excavating the Wilton type site in South Africa, turned the material over to his wife Jeanette, and I understand, although I've not seen the thesis which he produced yet, that they started from scratch and said, we don't know what any of the types are in the Wilton, and apparently they have done an attribute cluster on sealed, excavated, and I use it samples from various levels, and have simply made the clusters show them what the types are. I understand that very many of the types which I'm inclined to use don't in fact hold up under this kind of examination.
Do you know how they define their attributes?
No, I'm sorry, I can't give you more detail, and I just want to get the message across that it has been done, and it seems to be a likely passageway to pursue this problem, to get out of the fossilization.
Well, it's the kind of thing that Jim Sackett and Bob Whalen were trying to do also.
Yeah.
Lots of people are doing this or have done it.
Yeah, there have been many attempts.
But there isn't any panacea coming.
No, sure.
The Nick David and Mobius volume.
Every time I look at and my own attempts at this, I come up against the problem of the dichotomy between a technological attribute and a typological attribute, or stylistic attribute. And this is what we haven't resolved at all.
That's true.
Even in our own minds. I mean, when is this a pattern of continuous variation, or is there a break in between that you can make the separation at? And in the classification of any group of lithic artifacts, you must make this distinction.
We sure agree on that.
Can I hark back to a piece of earlier semantics just for a second? A number of remarks have been passed this afternoon, which makes it clear that several people agree that when you make a collection, or when you punch a hole in the ground and grub stones out of it, you are, I believe Fred used the term plug, you're taking out a plug. That is a plug from a larger population of artifacts. And in this sense, the very act of collecting and bringing together and analyzing is sampling. You are sampling a larger population of stuff out there or down there, which you don't know about. And in this sense, I would like again to support the word sample, even though it has statistical connotation.
But we should differentiate between a specimen and sample. Sample should be a representative specimen, and specimen could be anything from a collection.
The specimen is one object, though.
Not always.
Well, not necessarily.
In whose terms? A specimen is one thing, and well, it may be broken, you can stick it together again.
A sample have the connotation of being representative of the whole.
Not necessarily.
Well,
It need not.
it should be.
In archaeology, they usually aren't.
Can't one
In
assume
geology, it
that
has this meaning.
this
Yes,
is
in
some
geology it
hint?
does, that's not straight.
It is a sample about which you,
Yeah,
of
your
a
analysis,
population
all right.
about which you know nothing.
Yeah, you just said of a population. Now, this is why we objected to it in the first round.
That's right.
Because
Chucked it down.
it's only really a sample if you make the decision that it comes out of something that you want to talk about. For instance, our collection, which a chap collected during his life as he wandered around the world, is not really, in any meaningful sense, a sample. I suppose it is, at some level, a sample of artifacts, of the whole universe of artifacts. He may have collected everything from Chinese porcelain to aeoliths. So in some senses it is a sample, but a sample
But
is
it's
really, in most
probably-
instances, a decision you make. All right, now I think that my aggregate, my collection, is a sample of an assemblage, in Fred's term. So this is a first decision you may make about it.
All right. Now, Tony has grouped together a number of aggregates into an industry, and I hope we'd all agree that this reflection of apparently repeated behavior, exactly what the connection is between the behavior and the artifacts, none of us know, but it does reflect repeated behavior, which some of us in our more inebriated moments, I suppose, would call culture or something like this. That, I think, is what we're sampling. We're sampling fossilized behavior in the act of excavation.
Some parts of fossilized behavior.
Well, we're sampling. Sample is always a
Some fossilized parts of behavior.
Yes, well, that's what we're interested in, finding the parts.
And how they introduce
Yes, but surely the taxonomists like to speak in terms of nested sets, I believe. And your sample pertains to one or another levels in this hierarchy. We refer to a hierarchical scheme or a nested set. And you have to know what it is you're sampling if you're going to draw meaningful conclusions from this. And that's why, if you're dealing on the occurrence level, you have samples pertaining to that occurrence. And when you have made inferences about a number of assemblages, or if you want to compare the actual samples from various occurrences over a wider area, whatever your parameters were here for the next higher level in this hierarchical scheme, then your samples are pertaining to that next level, and you're looking for a different kind of inference. This is what the biologists do all the time. If you look at Simpson's great classificatory scheme, in which he discusses not only biology, but a whole philosophy of the system of classification, he's not talking about species at all in there. He's talking about this series of hierarchical levels. I think he starts at the genus, and then he goes clear on up to superfamilies or whatever phylum, whatever the end product of that is.
But if it's behavior that one's talking about, one wonders really sort of how valid these taxonomic units are, because if you look at Australian artifacts, for example, or New Guinea artifacts, you will find classification by the people who use them into two main groups only, and yet archaeologists, if these were prehistoric tools, would classify these things into probably sort of 2 or 3 dozen different kinds of types. So types in that particular instance are absolutely invalid. The attribute certainly is the basic point from which one has to go on to try and reach an idea of behavior.
If we really believed that was always true, we'd all be out selling neckties.
Well,
it'd just be hopeless.
That's one of things.
What we do may be all wrong, but by God, we do it well, right?
Yeah, well, that's why I feel.
It may be that the average researcher is not very good psychologist. This is also possible.
I think the question...
One feels there should be a much greater concentration, though, on features of the actual occupation site, rather than on the pure taxonomy. That's what the point I was trying to get over.
Well, the thing here is, however, Desmond, would be in terms of the kind of thing that we're aiming at here, and in the outline they did refer back to the Berg-Wartenstein thing in terms of a cultural stratigraphic framework. Would the archaeologist classifying the Australian Aboriginals material into the 2030 types, whatever, come up with meaningful kind of results. It might have nothing to do with behavior, but would he separate two different Australian groups, or would he recognize time distinctions, or what, by this kind of analysis?
Somebody ought to do this.
Unfortunately, for most of the stuff we're dealing with, we don't have a bunch of live Aborigines to ask about.
Exactly.
Well, we do happen to know that Australian Aboriginal artifactual material does classify in a way, it does produce patterns of just the kind we do, despite this poor discrimination on the part of the people who make them.
Would it be permissible to shift the discussion slightly? Is it appropriate this afternoon that we talk about something you raised earlier this morning about trying to compare the Cormusen with the Still Bay sort of thing? Is that appropriate now? What reminded me of this suddenly was someone, I'm sorry I've forgotten who, raised the analogy of zoological taxonomic procedure for using a name of the thing which was first described, and I would like to know what the opinion is at this table. I've already discussed this with Glyn. I'd like to know other people's opinions on the usefulness of retaining a term like Still Bay when the Still Bay type aggregate sample assemblage is mixed, numerically distorted, small in numbers, and from the surface. Are we to go on talking about the Still Bay? If you wish, I could go into more detail about exactly what is there and what was found and all the rest of it.
May I ask what value is the term Still Bay to you?
Yes, well, this is really what I'm asking.
It has or hasn't, depending on who you are, some meaning in your head. Like when you say Ushtala retouch, bingo, you see it right there. And if you don't see it, then it has no meaning. Yeah, but if you do see it, then it's a useful sort of device in order to introduce somebody to something.
Well, could I ask a practical question? Does someone, bingo, see the Still Bay?
So what is it?
The Still Bay only shortly means what it has been, what has been described in various different regions, poorly or more adequately sometimes, and is in the literature. Otherwise, it means nothing at all.
Well, no,
it's merely simply a name to hang on to onto something that has been described under present conditions.
I think a point that I might make here that Still Bay and Cormusen are not the same level of taxonomic concept.
Sure they're not.
Yeah, that's one point.
I would also point out that I suppose you know, Berg-Bartenstein meeting did recommend that this term not be used, that is, as a formal taxonomic designation.
But the other thing, Glenn, is that we all realized after we left Berg-Bartenstein that we went way ultra vires there. That no committee has the right to make that kind of thing. That has to be done by proposing alternative nomenclatures which are subsequently become acceptable. You can point out in a conference that you think it's a bad term and that it should be replaced as soon as someone defines it.
These were merely recommendations to the Pan-African Congress, actually.
They want to legislate either.
Yeah, they didn't.
Even less.
They didn't, in fact, but I was merely pointing out that this collection of Africanists there saw no value in it.
Well, but to answer Fred's point in part, if someone says, I have a Still Bay, there are a couple of things that you can predict he's probably got. They're not very useful things to have predicted to you, but he probably has got some bifacial trimmed points, and he probably has got some kind of prepared core substratum to it. These are very generalized features, and it may be the word for that reason has no value at all.
He probably also would have had a geographic...
He'd been in Africa.
Yeah, he probably would have been in
You find the same thing with the Ibram-Maruzi. You know, all it implies to you, all it implies to me is that it has blatelets. Now, what does that mean? Nothing. You take a look at later on tonight or something like that. Take a look at those indices and see what they, which every site on there has been grouped under the term Ibram-Maruzi.
Well, the blatelets also have to have some kind of bending down one edge.
They've been trying to change the term Ibram-Maruzian since it was introduced. Since
Surrey
worked in 1893, that's right. Muelan, Iranian, I don't care what you call it. Whatever it is, in 1952 at the Pan-African Conference, they decided to keep the term. At Berg-Bartenstein, the Balu and the Balu article said, well, we should use that term, the little two-page thing talking
That's
about.
because the French vested interest in this. They'll never change it.
Yeah,
unless
well-
they themselves, one of them themselves, find some absolutely perfect thing that will allow them to do it. No one else can tell them how to change this because, as in